Hello and welcome to Social Influence Lesson 1, Introduction to Social Influence. Let's kick off with a poem. So this is John Donne. No man is an island. I love the first line of this poem and it encapsulates what we're looking at in social influence perfectly. The idea that no individual acts without reference to others. We are constantly being influenced. Every man is a piece of the continent. Donne obviously was not necessarily talking about social influence research, but we can torture this poem to fit our needs. So this idea that no individual acts without reference to others. Other people influence us. That's what we're going to be looking at today. We're going to be looking at types of conformity. That conformity is the way people will influence us. And there are three subtypes that we're going to look at: internalization, identification, and compliance. And to a lesser extent, we're going to look at explanations of conformity, normative, and informational social influence. As there will always be with these presentations, there are guide notes available on the portal or on Blend Space that you can use. There is information in the presentation that is not in the guide notes, and you are expected to go beyond this. You are not expected to do the bare minimum here. I've done a huge amount of work for you. You got to do the rest. So let's have a look. What is social influence? Well, it's part of social psychology. It's interested in the nature and causes of human social behavior. Social psychologists are interested in the influence other people have on our behavior. And there's a link here to a topic we'll look at later, which is called behavioral economics, which is very much interested in how behavior is shaped by, for example, advertising and things like that. Right, the best thing to do then is let's come up with some ways in which other people influence your behavior. I want you to write these down on your guide notes or somewhere. I want you to consider how people explicitly influence your behavior and implicitly influence your behavior. Pause the video now. Okay, welcome back. What I'd like you to do is bring those with you to next lesson, and we'll have a short discussion at the beginning. So, a definition of conformity. Conformity is sometimes also known as majority influence, and it's essentially when individuals' behavior and or beliefs are influenced by what the majority of people are doing or think, or the group norm. And this results in a change in your behavior and or beliefs. There are three types identified by Kelman. There's public compliance, internalization, which is private, and identification. We'll look at each of these in turn, providing examples as we go. Public compliance. So public compliance is the superficial, public, and often transitory. Transitory means it doesn't last. Change in behavior and expressed attitudes in response to requests, coercion, or group pressure. So people publicly comply. The reason for it, the explanation, is what's called normative social influence, and you'll find more about this in the guide notes. This is a desire to be accepted, or because the group that we want to conform to has the power to reject us, which is a form of punishment. You can probably think of scores of instances where you in the past publicly complied, but privately held a different opinion. When someone else challenges you publicly, especially someone of higher status maybe, or someone who you want to fit in with, and you just go along because you want to be part of that group. When you've lied about liking something or liking someone in order to be viewed favourably by a group, that's public compliance or compliance. Right, private acceptance then. This is the deepest level. We call this internalization. This is when your behaviour and beliefs actually change and become permanently different. An example might be if you live with a vegetarian. A friend of mine, his partner is a vegetarian. He was quite partial to the cheeseburgers. He got with his partner, and now he's a vegetarian and he orders a lot of hummus. That is internalization. Probably, it would, God forbid they ever break up, it would be interesting to see if he reverted to eating meat. But this could be a good example of internalization. Internalization is usually the result of, or explained by, informational social influence. So we look to others to find out what is the right way of behaving. When you turn up for your first day at university, you're going to see hundreds, maybe even thousands of students walking in all directions. If you don't know where to go, you'll follow the crowd until new information presents itself. One of the most interesting examples of internalization is something I experienced myself as I get a bit older. And that's this idea that actually when we're younger, we tend to have these more radical views. And as we grow older, we become slightly more conservative. So when I was younger, I was a Trotskyite maybe. I was a socialist. I believed in the forced redistribution of wealth. As I got older, my views become more libertarian, but in some ways more conservative as well, and that led to a real change in me, a permanent change. I would like to think it's as a result of becoming more educated and knowing more, i.e. informational social influence, being influenced by people I perceive to know more. I never forget one of the turning points in my young socialist career was on an anti-capitalist march, having a conversation with someone who had never read Marx, which seemed absurd. How could you be in this big group with Karl Marx as the deity almost, and not at least have read the book? So in some ways I started looking at those groups as being less informed, and therefore informational social influence led me down a different path. It will you as well. Identification then. This is the third type we look at, and this is a specific form of conformity where we desire to belong to a particular group, and we'll change our views publicly and privately to fit in with that group. However, once we leave that group, our views may revert over time. Football fans are a classic example. They will wear a particular shirt, they will dress in a particular way to identify with a group and behave in a particular way. Dijksterhuis and Van Nippenburg did a great study on this on priming, showing that when you get into that environment, you identify with these groups, you behave in ways that may be uncharacteristic outside that. So I think it was one of the researchers, I can't remember which one, was walking to a football game. He's quite an elderly gentleman, saw a can on the floor, shuffled up to it and kicked it, and it hit the window of a car. This was him identifying with, in this case, football hooligans, maybe getting a little overexcited and behaving differently as a result. When he's back in the faculty, I suspect his behaviour reverts to a more predictable nature. So we've got compliance, internalization and identification, and two explanations for why we conform: normative, the desire to fit in, and informational, because we just don't know what the right answer is, so we look at or look for experts. Evaluation. Evaluation is going to be key in psychology. All year we're going to be evaluating research, theories constantly. At A2 this is worth more in some ways than the other elements. So what we're actually evaluating, let's have a look. Well, one way we can evaluate a theory, an idea, and this is a theory. This is a theory of conformity. Different types, different explanations. One way we can evaluate a theory is by providing research, empirical evidence, where people have gone out, carried out studies that support our claims. So let's take normative social influence and compliance, and they're linked. Normative and compliance are linked. So remember, compliance is I publicly change my behaviour and or attitudes, beliefs, but privately keep my views. And I do that in order to fit in with a particular group. So Schultz et al. 2008, they gathered data from 132 hotels in rooms where people were staying for 1 week. In all rooms, a message was placed on the door stating that the environmental benefits of reusing towels. If you stayed in a hotel, you will have seen these very stickers or messages plastered at various locations in your hotel room. Essentially, they want to reduce the number of fresh towels that they provide because the dry cleaning, or I'm not sure how they clean them, actually boil clean maybe, the cleaning is environmentally damaging. It uses a lot of energy. So they want to reduce this. In half the rooms, they put a second message though. So they've all got environmental benefits. This is information. You may not have been aware that you were damaging the environment by not reusing your towel. However, in half the rooms, they put a second message. And in this message, it just told the participants how many guests, in this case 75%, reuse their towels each day. So this is establishing a social norm, a typical behaviour for this group. And this is then normative social influence. Well, how do you think this affected the behaviour of the participants? Well, they found that 25% of people were less likely to request fresh towels if they had this second message. So the environmental benefits didn't really sway us, but thinking that Joe Bloggs in the room down from us is reusing his towel, as is the majority of people on our corridor, influences us. So we are more likely to reuse our towel to comply with the request on the wall or the group norm, and change our behaviour as a result. Remember, it's not informational because both groups were given the information, but only the group that had this second message were less likely to request fresh towels, more likely to reuse their towels. So this shows how strong normative social influence is and causes compliance. No one even had to be in the room to tell us to behave this way. So one piece of evidence in favour of normative social influence as an explanation for conformity and compliance as a type of conformity was Schultz. Now we're going to look at evidence for evidence carried out, research carried out by Lincolnbach and Perkins, 2003. They found that US teenagers exposed to normative messages that the majority of their peers did not smoke were subsequently less likely to take up smoking. Pause the video and ask yourself, what type of conformity is this? Is this normative? Is this informational? Explanation. What type is it? Is it compliance? Is it internalization, identification? Pause it. Okay, welcome back. Well, normative messages, majority of their peers, giving you a very similar situation to Schultz. Essentially, this is further evidence for normative social influence. Now, another way we can evaluate something, a theory, is if it has a practical application. So it's not just, wow, we got this theory, AO1, explanation. We've got this evidence, AO3, backing it up. We can also say, not only have we got this evidence backing it up, we've got a practical application of this, of how we can use it in the real world to achieve some good, in this case, preventing adolescents from taking up smoking or, helping the environment, whatever it may be. We've got practical applications from this research. So there's lots of practical applications. Pause the video, have a think of at least one that we haven't covered already. So don't use the environment and don't use smoking. Think about how these normative messages might and sometimes are used to change our behaviour. Pause it now. Alright, welcome back. Hopefully you come up with really cool ones and you'll share them with us at the beginning of the next lesson. I was just thinking about speeding. The majority of people do not speed. There was a campaign a few years back that said most people don't drink and drive. And that was interesting. Anyway, more evidence for normative social influence. Okay, now we're going to look at some evidence for informational social influence. This is my favourite study in this section, but it can be a little tricky to get your head around. So, they investigated the role of informational social influence in political opinion. Participants were shown televised presidential debates. During the debates, participants were shown what they thought was the reaction of their fellow participants on screen during the debate. So these were audience members. What they found was the participants took their cues from audience members, the reactions on audience members. So if they favoured one candidate over another, this would sway the individual's beliefs or opinions. Now, this is not normative. This is not a majority. This is people who don't really know which is the best candidate in this case, changing their views, following the lead of people they consider to be more expert in the field. If you want to know more about a study, I'm happy to discuss it with you. It is one that I'm quite fond of. You can find the full study here, and there is a QR code if you have a device that will take you there. Easy peasy. I really wish I hadn't just said easy peasy. Right, anyway. This is a key study. I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time on this because we're going to look at it in more detail in class. Ash carried out the foundational study on conformity, took 50 male students. Over his trials, he had about 130 plus. Mostly USA participants were told that they were taking part in a vision test. They were asked to judge the length of 3 lines. The answer was obvious, but Confederates deliberately gave the wrong answer. They showed an overall 37% conformity rate. They found 75% of participants conformed on at least one trial, 5% conformed on every trial, and 25% never conformed. There is a link here that will take you to a video of this experiment. To give you some idea of what the lines look like, you were asked to say which of these lines, A, B or C, was the same length as Exhibit 1. The answer is obvious, hopefully. You can tell that it's A. The Confederates would give deliberate wrong answers, so the Confederates would say B. Interestingly, Ash ensured that he was the one who decided where participants sat, so often the real participant would be the last person to sit, to enter the room. Everyone else would be a Confederate. A Confederate is just like an actor. They're just someone who plays a role that's dictated by the experimenter. In this case, Ash told these guys all to give wrong answers, and this guy's the real participant. So by the time it gets to him, he's sitting there thinking, what? Like, I know this is the right answer. What's wrong with these people? And these participants suffered quite a lot of anxiety, and a few of them were sweating and things like that because of the pressure they were being put under. When I was at university in my first year, they tried to carry out a similar experiment on us, and it didn't quite work. But there were quite a few people who felt quite stressed out by it. So that's Ash. So we looked at evaluating a theory by providing evidence. I've got theory X, here's my evidence for it, and the more evidence I have, the stronger my theory is. We can also evaluate the evidence we're providing. So Ash is an example of normative social influence. People knew what the right answer was, but they gave the wrong answer anyway. They complied. What we can do with Ash, though, is we can say, Was it a fair test? Was it a fair experiment? Were there problems with the way it was conducted? So one of the issues was Ash actually only used males. Now this is interesting. You may say, so what? Men and women, there's no difference. Well, we don't know. We didn't know at the time anyway. Women have traditionally always been thought of as being more compliant, less so in modern times, but in old-fashioned misogynistic sort of past, women would have been seen as more compliant. So Ash was making assumptions based on all males. A more representative sample would have been useful here. The task is incredibly artificial. We want to take Ash's research on conformity and apply it to real situations, like bullying in school, or maybe even extremes of why people conform in institutions and stuff like that. But really his research is just looking at lines, and it doesn't really matter. There's no consequence for getting it wrong, really. Maybe people got bored or they didn't bother really engaging with the task. I said a couple of them got quite stressed, sweaty, they were upset by it. Solomon did not protect these participants, and he couldn't have got informed consent. He couldn't have said, look, would you mind taking part in my conformity experiment? I'm going to trick you into it, because as soon as he's told them that, the experiment's ruined. So he had to deceive them, but he did cause psychological stress. Deception, you should never deceive anyone, it's naughty, but he had to do it. Again, if he told the truth, he would not have got the same results. Perrin and Spencer in 1980 carried out an exact replication of Ash's original study. They found that only 1 out of 396 trials did a single participant, conform with an incorrect majority. This suggests that Ash's study, his findings, may have been a product of his time, i.e. it suffers from historical validity issues. Maybe people just conform more back in the 50s than they do today. And there's an argument for that. Personal examples of conformity, I've sort of hit on these already. Can you bring them with you next time to class, and we'll discuss them and laugh at them in a supportive way, a therapeutic way. Okay, that's what we've covered today then. So we've looked at types of conformity, compliance, identification, internalization. You need to know each of these. You need to know the difference between normative and informational social influence. I didn't put them here, sorry. And the key research, which in this case is Schultz, Fine, and Lincoln, Back and Perkins. It'd be a good idea, you have to know Ash. He's actually mentioned in the spec, but you need to know him in such detail that I think we'll spend a bit of time going through Ash's study with a fine-tooth comb. Right, the presentation isn't over. There's more if you want it. I'm about to go into exam technique, but in terms of the bare minimum that's required to succeed next lesson, this is the stuff that you need, that you should have notes on, that you should have watched and thought about. Stay with me and we'll go through some exam style questions, a bit more about exam technique that will set you up for your first assessment pretty well. So we're going to look at using research to get our evaluation marks. We're going to look at the different assessment objectives and how we actually write an evaluation. It's actually more complicated than it may seem. So examination technique. Assessment objectives. Assessment objectives are what the examiner is looking for. He wants you to have 3 skills. He wants you to be able to tell him about psychology, prove that you understand it as well, apply your knowledge to a novel situation that you haven't come across before, and evaluate your knowledge using psychological terminology. So three assessments: knowledge, application, evaluation. That means that you need to understand what these are. So the first one's pretty straightforward. It's something you've done at GCSE quite well. And it's about describing it. So you could be asked to describe compliance, describe internalization. But it's not just dump it on the page. It's describe it, providing psychological information, using key terminology, demonstrating an understanding. Always use an example. Provide detail. Make sure you use specific figures. If you're talking about Ash's study, don't say people conform. Say 37%. Don't say some people didn't conform. You say 25% never conformed. This is the difference between really achieving those your targets and not achieving your targets. Select the appropriate material. Don't just brain fart on the page and put everything you've ever covered on there. You select it. Do you need to say, for example, that participants were led into a room, they were sat down, blah, blah, blah? Probably not. You need the core information that's going to drive your argument further. You need clear and coherent presentation of your ideas, so they need to be written clearly, precisely, in a scientific manner. So that's your AO1. Roughly half your marks are AO1 in an essay, and on the papers it's about a third. AO2, students notoriously find this difficult. Essentially, you've just been asked to take what you knew for AO1 and apply it. So look at this example. John started university, believed the UK should have nuclear weapons. His friends were against it, and now he's changed his mind. Later, he is now campaigning against nuclear weapons. So this is an example of internalization, possibly informational social influence. Could be normative to an extent, but more informational. He has permanently changed his belief about nuclear weapons and his behaviour. Okay, so that's our scenario. In an AO2 question, you're always given a STEM. That's called the STEM, by the way. It's a scenario. So the first thing you've got to do is extract key information. The question says, which of the following best describes John's change in belief? I don't know what that said, but how would we explain it? Let's go through and say what's happening. We know it's internalization, but how? We forgot the key point. He started university, believed he was in favour of nuclear weapons. His friends at university were against it. John or David, depending on who you talk to, fell under pressure to conform. So he would say, so he starts off maybe complying. By the time he finishes university, he's a believer. So that's the process, isn't it? It starts, he's in favour, his friends are against, he conforms due to pressure, and by the end believes it. 4 marks, 4 points potentially. There's actually only 2 marks available here, so you need to be careful. Now we pair it with our knowledge of conformity. We say this is an example of internalization because X, Y, Z, and we back it up with our knowledge, and we're going to use these quotes to prove our point. Okay? AO3 then is an evaluation. This is where we are taking a piece of research or a theory and we're saying what its strengths and weaknesses are, maybe applications, implications, and so forth. Evaluation just means what is the value of a thing. You evaluate constantly. You're evaluating people. You're evaluating psychology. Is it the right subject? Do you wish you picked something else? You're evaluating things all the time. You just do it implicitly. What we need to do is learn how to evaluate explicitly. So, that's AO3. Let's see how all this comes together then. Outline and evaluate the idea of compliance. 4-mark questions, so we haven't got a huge amount of space and time here. In this question, there's 2 assessment objectives, outline and evaluate. Outline is AO1, it just means give me your knowledge, describe. In detail, specific, provide examples if you can, but it's only 2 marks. And then 2 marks for evaluate. This is saying, how is compliance a reliable or decent explanation for conformity? So here's the route we're going to take. AO1 for compliance, we're going to describe it as compliance is going along with the group without, that's supposed to say accepting, my apologies, by the power of computers, accepting. Remember, never be afraid to make a mistake, just make sure you always learn from them. AO1, compliance is going along with the group without accepting their point of view. Right. So compliance is going along with the group without accepting their point of view. There is no change in our underlying attitudes, only our public behaviour. That's not bad. I mean, I would like to see an answer with beliefs in it as well, but that's absolutely fine. 2 marks. We haven't got a lot of time. 1 mark for the first part, 1 mark for the second. This is really explaining this in more detail, this being more specific. Now, the evaluation, we use a method called point evidence explanation. What we do with point is make a claim. So we say, there's evidence for this by a guy called Schultz. Now imagine I stopped there. I said, you know, I've got a technique that's going to guarantee you an A, and then I stop the conversation and walk out. It's pretty disappointing. You know, what method? You know, tell me more, sir. So we need to back this up. You can't just make claims about things. You know, I have magical powers. All right, come on then. So you provide some evidence. Schultz says the evidence we're claiming we have. We need to explain a bit about what Schultz did. So our point is, evidence supporting compliance comes from Schultz. Now look, I've cut that huge study down into just 3 lines really. Gathering data from, that's the text-to-speech software. 132 hotels. From 132 hotels, they found that people were 25% less likely to request fresh towels in rooms that contained a message stating, same about blah blah blah, you know stuff. So, text to speech sucks, right? Towels each day. So we've got our point, our claim, we've got evidence, it supports compliance. What is our evidence? Well, it's here. Explanation. This demonstrates normative social influence as participants desired to gain approval by fitting in with the majority by reusing their towels. Don't know. And that is how we outline and evaluate. Now, a couple of things. You notice evaluation's a lot longer for 2 marks. There are short ways of doing it, but this is the way we're going to learn to do it for now, because this is how top students will write this. They will say a point, maybe evidence from a study, the evidence briefly outlined, and why it matters. This matters because. Okay. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you for putting up with the errors. I'm sure the text-to-speech software will get better next time. If you have any questions, you know where I am. I'm in MG3 or MG1. Come and see me anytime. Ask each other, support each other, practice what we have covered today, and I'll see you next lesson. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.